How to live without regret. Have you ever found yourself lying awake at night, haunted by the echoes of past decisions, thinking, if only I had done this differently? Regret. It's a heavy word, isn't it? A word that carries with it the weight of mistakes, missed opportunities, and choices we wish we could undo. But what if I told you that regret, in its most profound sense, isn't something we have to carry forever? What if it's possible to live a life where we're no longer chained by the past, no longer haunted by the what-ifs? In this video, we're going to explore a deeply transformative question: how can we live without regret? Regret is a universal experience. We've all felt it, whether it's over a relationship we didn't nurture, a job we didn't pursue, or the times we said things we didn't mean. The nature of regret is often tied to our inability to change what's already been done, and the more we dwell on it, the more we trap ourselves in a cycle of negativity. It's as if we're living with one foot in the past, while the present slips away unnoticed. But here's the catch: regret, when examined closely, is often rooted in something deeper than just mistakes. It's rooted in attachment. Attachment to our desires, attachment to how we think things should have been, and attachment to the illusion that we can control the outcomes of our lives. Now, imagine a life where you're not burdened by these attachments. A life where you can move through each moment without the weight of the past dragging you down. How would that feel? Would you be more at peace? Would you be more free? Today, we'll dive into these questions, and we'll explore how Buddhist teachings offer profound wisdom that can help us free ourselves from the prison of regret. But before we begin, let's take a moment to understand what regret truly is. Regret doesn't live in the present, it lives in the past. It clings to moments that are long gone, moments that are beyond our control. And that's where our journey begins, recognizing that the past is no longer ours to change. Now that we've explored the nature of regret, let's take a moment to look at a key teaching in Buddhism that can change the way we experience life and, ultimately, how we handle regret. Impermanence. The Buddha, in his teachings, often spoke of anicca, the law of impermanence. He taught that all things, and I mean all things, are in a constant state of flux. Nothing stays the same. No feeling, no situation, no object, and certainly not our lives. The past? It's gone. The future? It's not here yet. What's left? The present moment. But here's the profound part: this impermanence isn't something to fear. In fact, when we truly grasp the idea of impermanence, we can start to see how it offers us freedom. Think about it: regret is only possible because we cling to the past, don't we? We hold on to those what-ifs, those could-haves and should-haves. We think about the moments we can never relive, the paths we didn't take, the words we didn't speak. We attach to them, almost as if we believe we can somehow change them, but the past is gone, and it's never coming back. That's the nature of life: it's fleeting. Every breath you take, every moment that passes, is part of an ever-moving river of time. You can't grab onto a moment once it's passed. It's as if the past is a shadow, always there, but never able to be touched. What does this mean for us? It means that regret, at its core, is a misunderstanding of reality. It's us holding on to something that no longer exists, thinking we can control it, change it, or make it better. When we understand anicca, when we embrace the idea that everything is always changing, we begin to realize that nothing is permanent. This applies to both the good and the bad. The joy, the sadness, the successes, the failures, each moment is part of a cycle, and none of them are meant to last forever. So, what happens when we stop clinging to the past? When we truly internalize the truth of impermanence, we can let go of our attachments and live freely in the present. This doesn't mean we forget our past or erase our memories. It means we no longer let the past control us. We stop allowing it to define who we are today, and that's the key to letting go of regret. The more we understand impermanence, the more we learn to embrace the ever-changing flow of life. We can be at peace with what has happened, without needing to change it. Now, you might be wondering, if everything changes and nothing stays the same, does that mean our mistakes don't matter? Does it mean we don't have to learn from them? Absolutely not. Impermanence teaches us that life is an ongoing journey, a process of learning, growing, and evolving. Our mistakes are part of that process, but they don't define us. They're simply moments in time, experiences that come and go, just like everything else. So, how can we live without regret, knowing that everything is changing? It begins with letting go of the attachment to how we think things should have been. When we accept impermanence, we free ourselves from the burden of trying to change the past. And in that freedom, we can begin to live fully in the present, knowing that each moment is a new opportunity to act with wisdom, compassion, and clarity. As we explore further, we'll see how other Buddhist principles, like karma, also play a role in helping us release regret and live more mindfully. We've already learned that regret is often tied to our attachment to the past, to the belief that we can somehow rewrite what's been done. But what if I told you that the power to change, to transform regret into wisdom, lies in the very present moment, and in understanding one of the most profound teachings in Buddhism, karma? Karma is one of the most misunderstood concepts, often reduced to the idea of what goes around, comes around. But in its truest sense, karma is much more than that. It's not just about receiving what you give, it's about understanding the law of cause and effect. Every thought, every word, every action we take creates a ripple effect in the world. And these ripples shape the very nature of our experiences. In a way, karma is the lens through which we can view our choices. It teaches us that the consequences of our actions, no matter how small, are always present. But here's the key: karma doesn't imprison us in the past, it empowers us in the present. You see, often when we feel regret, it's because we look back and wish we could undo the mistakes we made. But the truth is, the past is already written. What we have right now, the only thing that truly matters, is this moment. And this moment is where our karma is being shaped. By understanding karma, we realize that while we can't change the past, we can shape our future by how we choose to act right now. Regret becomes powerless when we recognize that every new action we take is an opportunity to create something better. Something more aligned with our true nature. Think of it this way: our past actions, both good and bad, have brought us to where we are today. But the beauty of karma is that it doesn't hold us hostage. We're not defined by what we've done, we're defined by what we choose to do next. Let's say, for example, you've made a decision in the past that didn't turn out well. Maybe you hurt someone, maybe you didn't speak up when you should have. The natural inclination might be to dwell on that, to feel guilty or regretful. But with karma, there's another way. You have the power to create new causes, new actions, new intentions, and new thoughts that will bring about positive effects. And when we start acting with awareness, with intention, and with compassion, we begin to transform the very energy we've been holding on to. Instead of regret, we start to build something better. In Buddhism, this is known as the concept of skillful actions, actions that are aligned with wisdom, ethics, and compassion. When we choose to live this way, we don't just free ourselves from regret, we also contribute to the well-being of others and the world around us. Our actions no longer come from a place of fear, guilt, or longing for things to be different. Instead, they come from a place of understanding that every moment is a chance to plant new seeds of good karma. So, how do we break free from the cycle of regret? It starts with recognizing that while we can't change what's already been done, we can always choose to act with awareness and wisdom moving forward. Each action, no matter how small, creates a new opportunity, a new chance to build the future we desire, the future where regret no longer holds any power over us. The beauty of karma is that it doesn't judge us for our past mistakes. Instead, it offers us the chance to take responsibility and grow. It teaches us that the future is shaped by our present actions. And when we align ourselves with this wisdom, we begin to live with greater peace, purpose, and, most importantly, without regret. Now that we've explored the concepts of impermanence and karma, we arrive at a critical tool that can help us live more peacefully, without being weighed down by regret. This tool is called mindfulness. Mindfulness is one of the most transformative practices in Buddhism, and it holds the key to unlocking the peace and freedom we crave. But what exactly is mindfulness? In its simplest form, mindfulness is the practice of being fully present in each moment, without judgment. It's about bringing our awareness to what's happening right here, right now, instead of dwelling on the past or anxiously planning for the future. When we talk about regret, we're talking about the mind's tendency to cling to the past. We replay old stories, old mistakes, old what-ifs. We often look back and wish we had done things differently, but the simple truth is that we can't. The past is gone, and it only exists in our memories, but mindfulness changes this dynamic. Instead of being trapped in the cycle of regret, mindfulness invites us to break free from the mental chatter that keeps us stuck. It trains us to focus on the present, on the richness of this very moment. Imagine, just for a moment, being able to let go of the past. Imagine living your life without constantly ruminating over mistakes or missed opportunities. That's what mindfulness offers us, the ability to fully experience the present moment without judgment, without resistance, and without regret. When we practice mindfulness, we begin to cultivate a different relationship with our thoughts. Instead of being controlled by them, we start to observe them. We notice when regret arises, and instead of getting lost in it, we simply acknowledge it as it is, a thought, a feeling, a passing experience. We don't have to attach to it, and we don't have to identify with it. We can let it go. This is the power of mindfulness. It helps us realize that we are not our thoughts. Thoughts are like clouds drifting across the sky, they come and go. Some clouds might look dark and heavy, like regret, but just as the storm passes, so does the cloud. Mindfulness allows us to step back from these mental clouds and observe them with clarity and wisdom. This distance is crucial because when we're caught up in regret, we often become consumed by it. But through mindfulness, we can recognize that it's just a momentary experience, not a permanent state of being. The beauty of mindfulness is that it empowers us to live fully in the present moment. When we are fully present, we stop dwelling on past mistakes and missed chances. Instead, we embrace the power of now, because the present moment is the only time we truly have, and this is where regret starts to fade. By practicing mindfulness, we shift our attention away from the past and toward the richness of the present. We begin to realize that every moment is a fresh opportunity to make a new choice, to act with awareness, and to create positive karma. Mindfulness also teaches us to practice self-compassion. Instead of harshly judging ourselves for past decisions, we learn to treat ourselves with kindness and understanding. We all make mistakes. That's part of being human. But when we can approach ourselves with compassion, we stop allowing regret to control us. We see our mistakes as opportunities for growth, rather than as burdens to carry for the rest of our lives. As we move forward on our journey toward living without regret, we now come to one of the most important practices in Buddhist philosophy, self-compassion. We've explored the nature of regret, karma, and mindfulness. We've learned that regret often arises when we cling to the past, when we allow ourselves to be defined by our mistakes, or when we punish ourselves for what we believe we should have done differently. But here's the truth: no one is perfect. We all make mistakes, and those mistakes don't define us, they're simply a part of being human. This is where self-compassion enters the picture. Self-compassion is the practice of being kind, gentle, and understanding toward ourselves, especially when we fail or make mistakes. Instead of criticizing ourselves or drowning in regret, we offer ourselves the same kindness and understanding we would give to a friend who is struggling. Imagine for a moment that you're comforting a dear friend. They've made a mistake, and they're overwhelmed with regret. You wouldn't berate them or tell them they're worthless. No, you would offer them compassion, understanding, and support. You would remind them that everyone makes mistakes, and that they are not defined by their failures. Now, what if you could offer yourself that same level of compassion? What if you could treat yourself with the same kindness and understanding when you slip up or when regret creeps in? This is the essence of self-compassion. It's about being kind to yourself, especially when you're struggling. It's about recognizing that you, too, are worthy of love and forgiveness. And when we practice self-compassion, we begin to break free from the cycle of regret because we stop beating ourselves up over the past. Instead, we embrace our imperfections as part of our growth and evolution. The Buddha taught that suffering arises when we hold on to our attachments to things, to people, and, perhaps most painfully, to ourselves. We cling to an ideal of perfection, of how we think we should be. And when we inevitably fall short of that ideal, we suffer. But self-compassion invites us to release that attachment. It invites us to see ourselves as we truly are, not perfect, but whole. When we begin to practice self-compassion, we give ourselves the space to heal. We stop carrying the weight of past mistakes, and instead, we use them as stepping stones for growth. Instead of seeing our flaws as failures, we begin to see them as opportunities for transformation. Regret, in this sense, becomes a tool for personal evolution. It no longer weighs us down, it lifts us up. It teaches us about where we've been, what we've learned, and how we can become better, more compassionate people. Self-compassion doesn't mean excusing harmful behavior. It doesn't mean that we ignore the consequences of our actions. Instead, it's about acknowledging our mistakes, taking responsibility, and then offering ourselves the love and kindness that allow us to move forward. It's about saying, I am human. I made a mistake. But I am worthy of growth, of healing, and of love. And as we learn to forgive ourselves, we create space for forgiveness of others as well. When we are kind to ourselves, we can extend that same kindness to others, and we begin to live with a heart that is open and free from the burden of regret. As we continue our journey, we arrive at a pivotal step in the process of living without regret, forgiveness. Forgiveness is often seen as a noble, almost spiritual act, but what does it really mean to forgive? And why is forgiveness so crucial when it comes to letting go of regret? When we hold on to regret, we are often holding on to something from the past, something or someone that has hurt us, or something we've done to hurt others. We may feel anger, sadness, or even shame because of past actions. But here's the truth, holding on to these emotions only keeps us trapped in the past. Forgiveness doesn't mean condoning what was done. It doesn't mean forgetting what happened or pretending the hurt doesn't exist. What forgiveness truly is the act of releasing the emotional grip the past has on us. It's about freeing ourselves from the mental and emotional chains of resentment, anger, and regret. In Buddhism, we are taught that holding on to grudges or anger toward others is like drinking poison and hoping the other person will die. When we don't forgive, we are the ones who suffer. The bitterness, the anger, and the regret stay with us, they become a weight we carry in our hearts, but forgiveness, as difficult as it may be, offers us the chance to let go of that weight. It allows us to release the hurt, to stop reliving the past, and to free ourselves from its grip. Forgiveness is not for the other person. It is for you. It is the ultimate act of self-liberation. Think about the people you hold grudges against. The ones who have hurt you. How much space do they take up in your mind, your heart? How much energy are you spending on those past hurts? By not forgiving, you continue to allow the past to control your present. Every time you think about that person or that situation, you relive the pain. But forgiveness doesn't erase the past. It simply lets go of the emotional charge. It's like cleaning a wound. The wound might still be there, but the infection, resentment, anger, regret, can be healed. Forgiveness is an act of compassion, not just for others, but for yourself. It allows you to move forward with a lighter heart. It helps you clear the mental clutter that weighs you down, and it creates space for peace, joy, and love. Forgiveness allows you to stop living in the past and start living in the present moment. Now, we know that forgiving others can be challenging, but the first step in the process is forgiving ourselves. Often, the hardest person to forgive is the person we see in the mirror. We beat ourselves up for past mistakes. We feel guilty for the things we've done or the opportunities we've missed. But in order to truly let go of regret, we must first offer ourselves forgiveness. This means letting go of self-criticism, releasing the inner judgment, and embracing the simple truth that we are human. We make mistakes. We learn. We grow. But we don't need to hold ourselves hostage to the past. Forgiveness opens the door to freedom. It allows us to move forward, not with a sense of guilt or shame, but with an understanding that the past is done. We are not defined by our mistakes, but by the actions we take today. As we begin to forgive ourselves, we also begin to forgive others. Just as we release ourselves from the chains of past regrets, we can release others who have wronged us. We stop seeing them as perpetrators of pain, and instead, we see them as fellow beings on a journey, just like us, making their own mistakes, learning their own lessons. This is a deeply powerful practice. When we forgive, we let go of the emotional baggage that weighs us down. We free our hearts from the darkness of resentment, and we step into the light of understanding, compassion, and peace. As we arrive at the final chapter of our journey to living without regret, we come to the most important aspect of all, living fully in the present. Regret is born from our attachment to the past, whether it's the mistakes we've made or the opportunities we feel we've missed. But in order to truly free ourselves from regret, we must learn to live in the moment. The present moment is all we truly have. The past is gone, and the future is uncertain. The only place where we can truly live, breathe, and make a difference is right here, right now. This is where the practice of mindfulness comes into play. Mindfulness is the art of being fully present in whatever you are doing, whether it's washing the dishes, having a conversation, or simply sitting quietly. It's about being aware of each moment without judgment, without distraction, without regret. It's about truly experiencing life as it happens. Living in the present moment is a powerful antidote to regret. When we are fully engaged in the present, we are no longer weighed down by the past. We are free from the cycle of what could have been and what should have been. Instead, we are focused on what is, and that is where life truly unfolds. Think about your own life for a moment. How often do you catch yourself ruminating over past mistakes or worrying about the future? How much mental energy do you waste reliving old regrets or imagining worst-case scenarios? These thoughts pull us away from the present moment, from the joy and peace that is available to us right now. But when we bring our attention back to the present, we reconnect with the flow of life. Imagine you're sitting in a park, watching the leaves flutter in the breeze. If your mind is cluttered with thoughts of the past or future, you might miss the beauty of that moment. You might miss the joy of simply breathing, of hearing the birds chirp, of feeling the warmth of the sun on your skin. But when you're present, fully aware of what's happening around you, you experience life as it is, a precious, fleeting moment. The Buddha taught that the present moment is the only moment we truly have. By practicing mindfulness and being fully engaged in the present, we can release the grip of regret. We stop wishing things had been different. We stop holding on to what we cannot change. We simply experience the moment, and in doing so, we let go of the past. Living fully in the present moment is also about taking conscious action. When we are present, we are more aware of the choices we are making. We begin to live intentionally, making decisions that align with our values and our true purpose. We no longer drift through life on autopilot, replaying old regrets or anxiously anticipating the future. Instead, we make each moment count. This kind of mindful living is not about perfection. It's about showing up fully, with an open heart and mind. It's about doing our best in each moment, without clinging to outcomes, and trusting that we are exactly where we need to be. When we live this way, regret has no place in our hearts. There is no room for the what-ifs or if-onlys. There is only the power of now. In this final chapter, we've discovered that living without regret is not about erasing the past or ignoring the future. It's about learning to live fully in the present, with mindfulness, compassion, and forgiveness. It's about embracing the flow of life, accepting that mistakes are part of the journey, and making peace with where we are. And now, as you continue your journey, remember this: you are not defined by your regrets. You are a being of limitless potential, capable of growing, learning, and evolving with each breath you take. By practicing mindfulness, embracing self-compassion, and living fully in the present, you are free from the chains of regret. You are free to live with joy, peace, and purpose. Thank you for joining me on this journey toward living without regret. I hope these teachings have inspired you to let go of the past, to embrace the present, and to live with a heart full of peace and gratitude. If you've enjoyed this video and found it helpful, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you won't miss more insightful content on Buddhist teachings, mindfulness, and living a meaningful life. Your support helps the channel grow, and together, we can create a community of wisdom and peace. Zen Buddhism wisdom is here to guide you on your path. If you'd like to dive deeper into these topics, share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. And remember, live in the moment, and let go of regret.